John, can you pray for us?
Father, God, we come to you this evening with thanksgiving for you. Thank you for calling us to this place, God, for your Son Jesus, for the purpose that you have for our lives, God, the revelation of your will. God, we pray that you will stir in us a thirst, that we would seek you, that we would find you, that we would honor you in all that we do. In Jesus' name.
Okay, so the story of Israel. The story of Israel is two things especially. It's a family story and it's a geographical story. I like to emphasize that to give you an idea of what we're looking at. We're looking at a family and we're looking at an area. The area is the same area that there's conflict in today, and that's the Middle East. Now there's conflict all over the world, but you see a lot of conflict in the Middle East. You've got the Palestinians, the Israelis, and they're going back and forth, and it's really interesting because the Palestinians, Palestine means the land of the Philistines. Well, Philistines were one of the main enemies of Israel throughout all their biblical history as well. So they've got the same enemies that they've always had, really, which are the Philistines. They're just called Palestinians now. So you've got all this stuff going on over in the Middle East, and it really originates all the way back in the garden with Adam. Adam was in the beginning. God created the heavens and the earth. Then we had Adam and Eve. That bloodline, so I'm going to abbreviate this, just kind of, this is all one bloodline. Now obviously there are other offshoots, but these individuals and the intermediates are this is the particular bloodline that God has seen fit to pass His covenant through and to give us information about in the Bible. Now, let's think about this in terms of the New Testament. So in Matthew 7, Jesus tells us, enter ye in at the straight gate. For wide is the gate, broad is the way that leadeth unto destruction. Many there be which go in thereat. There's a broad way to destruction. He says, narrow is the way that leads to life. Well, you can think of, in order to populate the earth, there's all these branches going off all over the place. There's all these branches. There's other sons of Abraham. There's one of the sons of Noah is Ham. And Ham's descendants were generally cursed over there in Genesis 9. So we've got, this is all the broad way, you can kind of think of it. And we've got a narrow way here. It's a narrow family line that goes down from Adam, and then we've got Noah in the time of the flood, and he and his three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And so his three sons then go out and populate the world. You can generally think of it as this. His three sons, Japheth becomes kind of the Caucasians. Shem becomes kind of the Asians. And Ham becomes kind of the black races. So that's an easy way to generally think about it. Then you get Abraham. Abraham is the individual who God first establishes His covenant with concerning the present day, what we think of as the land of Israel. God calls him out of, and this is where we get into the geographical story, He calls him out of present day Iraq, which used to be called essentially Babylon, although it's called Ur of the Chaldees in the Bible. But Ur of the Chaldees was really close to the Babylon that was established in Genesis 11, where they built a tower and built a city, and they said, let us build this tower, let us make us a name, which is the origin of all, it's the origin of all evil things. Let us make us a name. Pride, idolatry, serving self. Okay, so Abraham is called out of Babylon, called out of Iraq, present day. He has a son, Isaac, which is his second born. And then Isaac has a son, Jacob, which is his second born. Jacob's name in Genesis 32 is changed to Israel. So Jacob really becomes Israel. His name is changed to Israel, and he has 12 sons. Well, we have 12 tribal plots of land here. So we've got 12 tribes, and those 12 tribes generally correspond to the 12 sons of Jacob. The reason I say generally is because there was one son who has kind of two descendants that are shown amongst the tribes here. Who is that who was split into two? What's that? No, we're talking about, so Japheth, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, those are the sons of Noah. We come down a little bit. It's Joseph. So Joseph has two sons. He's got Ephraim and Manasseh. And basically what happens is Levi, who is one of the children of Jacob, didn't get any inheritance. He's going to live, the Levites live all over this land of Israel, and they are the priests. They take care of ministering and judging. So they don't have any specific tribal plot. So because one of the tribes doesn't have any tribal plot, Joseph is split into two tribes, and we've got Ephraim and then Manasseh. And there's West and East Manasseh. One of the sons of Manasseh gets a plot over on this side of Jordan, and the other gets a plot on this side of Jordan. Then we go down the line. This is where you get into it being a geographical issue again, because Joseph is sold into slavery where? Egypt. Joseph is sold. Joseph is the 11th son down here. The 11th son is Joseph. He's sold into slavery in Egypt. Then he rises into power. Then all of Israel ends up, all of the sons of Jacob end up down in Israel with their brother Joseph. They end up spending 400 years down there in bondage because another Pharaoh rises up who didn't know Joseph and the things that he did. He probably knew of him. He just didn't think of him as a good person anymore. He saw these Israelites reproducing, multiplying, and he wanted to get rid of them. And that's when they said, kill every firstborn. From that, Moses arises, and Moses was called by God to lead the people out of Egypt. He leads them through the wilderness. Then he dies right before they come in to take this land. Joshua takes over from him. Then Joshua dies. We go through this period of about 300 years under Judges. And then after the period of 300 years under Judges, we go into Kings. They spend about 500 years under Kings. So they've got about 500 years, not just under Samuel and Saul. I was going to go into that. But they've got about 500 years under Kings. After about those 500 years under Kings, they go into captivity in Babylon. They spend 7 years in captivity in Babylon. Then they're called back. They rebuild Jerusalem. They set up the temple again. And then there's about 400 years of silent time between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And we're going to talk about a bridge. There's a bridge called the 70 Weeks of Daniel that leads us from the Old Testament to the New Testament, explaining why there were these silent years. Then we've got the New Testament, Jesus being born, or John the Baptist being born, then Jesus being born, the ministry of John the Baptist, the ministry of Jesus, then the ministry of the apostles, ending with the book of Revelation being written by John the Beloved, and then the end of the New Testament. So that's, in a nutshell, the Reader's Digest condensed version of the Bible. I've been wanting to just give you the whole thing, the whole timeline. Obviously, there's a whole lot of detail that we just skipped over, but what I want to focus on is we're here. We've gone through the life of Samuel, for the most part. We've gone through the life of Samuel. Now, can anyone remember from last week, who is Samuel?
The last judge.
He is the last judge. And who's probably, do you know who might be judging at the same time as him? Samson. So one of the things about the judges during the time of the judges is they were kind of tribal leaders that would lead in a particular place. So I can't remember where exactly Samson judged, but Samson would have been in one part of Israel, and then Samuel was in another part of Israel, judging at about the same time, because they were both opposing the Philistines. So that's one thing to keep in mind with the judges.
When you say judging, you mean rule the land?
Yeah, they ruled a particular place, and they were kind of like, almost like a pastor is in a church. They were like an under-shepherd. They were receiving their instruction from God and doing His bidding, but they weren't trying to rule all of the land. They were just kind of a method for God to deliver His people from the enemies, whoever they were fighting against at that particular time.
So they still had kings in those areas, and pharaohs and whatever.
Yeah, it wasn't like a king, because...
No, I'm saying that the land still had kings in that land. It's just these guys were judging certain parcels of the land.
Yeah, well, Israel didn't have a king.
Oh,
At that time, in fact, that's very important. Thank you for bringing that up. It's one of the most important things about the time period of the Judges. It says in the very last verse of Judges 21-25, it says, "There was no king in those days, and every man did that which was right in his own eyes." So what had happened, Moses was a righteous man. He was called by God. He led Israel through the wilderness. Joshua was a righteous man. He was called by God. He led the people into the land of Israel, led them on these big campaigns to take large parts of the land of Israel. But there was parts that they didn't take on those campaigns that they needed to take, but they kind of laid back and relaxed and ended up intermarrying, or at least dwelling with the people in the land, which specifically God said, don't do. And that's what He tells us as well in the New Testament. So just like Israel in the Old Testament was commanded to completely destroy and kill all of the people in the land, so we're also commanded to be separate from the world. It's destruction in the Old Testament is similar to separation in the New Testament. It's the spiritual version of it, because we have to separate ourselves from evil and from unbelievers. And when I say separate, I mean not fellowship. So people will say, well, Jesus hung out with sinners. Yes, but Jesus knew the hearts of men. He knew who were His. Now, there's a difference between preaching to someone and fellowshipping with them. We're to preach to everyone. But if someone doesn't want to hear the Word of God, if they're an unbeliever, if they don't care about God, you shouldn't be hanging out with that person, eating with them, going bowling with them. That's not a person to hang out with. Because if you think that you hanging out with them and playing with them is going to lead them to God, no. You hanging out with them and playing with them is going to lead you away from God. And that's what God told His people not to do. He said completely destroy them, because if you hang out with them, if you play with them, if you dwell with them, they are going to turn your heart away from God. If you intermarry with them, they are going to turn your heart away from God. Intermarriage has never been about black or white, or skin color, or any of that. It's always about belief and unbelief. A believer should not marry an unbeliever, because the unbeliever will turn the believer's heart away from God. That happened to Saul, who is the son of David, who we're about to get into. So the period of Judges was a very disorganized period. There was nobody like Joshua, who was a leader over all of Israel at a particular time. You had these tribal leaders, and even the tribal leaders did things that weren't that good. Like at the end of his leadership, one of the judges, his name was Gideon, he got all the people to give them his gold, and he essentially made an idol, just like happened in the wilderness when all the people came to Aaron and said, "Make us a god," and he makes a golden calf, and then says, "This is the God that led you up out of Egypt." So that same type of thing happens under the judges. You've got these judges that they're pretty good, they do righteous things, but they've got their faults. Like Gideon made that idol. Like Samson is a womanizer. Samson's constantly going after these women. For example, Delilah. You've all heard the story about Samson and Delilah, probably. How she kept kind of tempting him and got him to give her his secret of his strength, that it came from the fact that he had grown his hair out in a vow to God. So God had given him strength in accordance with a vow that he was fulfilling to God, and then she shaved off his head and delivered him to the Philistines. So these judges had faults. They were righteous people, but they had faults. And that continues throughout the Bible. Even the kings are righteous. Some of them are righteous, but they've got, even the righteous ones have faults. And we're going to talk about that. If we don't get into it tonight, we'll certainly get to it next week. So Samuel is one of the last judges, probably judging at the same time as Samson. And he is unique because his mother, Hannah, had asked for him from God and dedicated him to a lifetime of service to God. Samuel then turns around after he's grown up. He judges the people, but then the people over there in 1 Samuel 8 ask for a king. And who is the king that they get? Saul. So they get this king, Saul. He's a tall guy. He's head and shoulders above all the people of Israel. He's tall, he's handsome, good looking, and he starts out good. He starts out kind of humble. He leads Israel on a good victory over the Ammonites. Nahash of the Ammonites comes in, I think in chapter 11, and he tries to basically take down part of Israel. He comes to this one city and says, I'll make a covenant with you that I won't destroy you completely if you let me pluck out all of your right eyes. So that's when they send messengers to Saul and say, help, 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 help. And he sends out a war cry. They all come together and they defeat Nahash. So then all the people get behind him and they say, yes, he's a great king, he's a great king. Well, he's got his ups, but he's also got his downs. So where we left off last week was 1 Samuel 15. Let's turn back to there right now. And I know Randy especially, that we're going quick through this. That's a lot of information. I don't expect you to get it all. I don't expect anyone to get all of this information. I'm trying to present it as succinctly, condensed as possible, but also keep the integrity of the information. So Saul has already messed up once in 1 Samuel 13 when he didn't properly wait for Samuel to come. They had made an agreement, and Saul was supposed to wait for Samuel in order to offer burnt offerings to God before they went into war. Well, he didn't wait the way he was supposed to. He got impatient, and so he messed up. He offered it right before Samuel got there. So Saul messed up once, and he messes up big time in chapter 15. In chapter 15, the context is Samuel is giving a message to Saul in verse 2. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, I remember that which Amalek did to Israel, how he laid wait for him in the way when he came up from Egypt. Now, what's the context here? Well, when he came out from Egypt, when Moses led the people across the Red Sea and into the wilderness, immediately these people, Amalek, the Amalekites, come up and they attack them from behind, nonetheless, in the wilderness. Israel hadn't done anything to them, but they come up and they attack them. So God is saying, believe me, I have not forgotten what they did. And he says, now go, in verse 3, and smite Amalek, and utterly destroy all that they have, and spare them not, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass. He's serious. God is very serious, but his judgment is a very serious judgment. But Saul only goes part way. So what Saul does is he goes and takes his soldiers down to Amalek, and they kill most of the people, and they killed most of the animals. But what they did in verse 8, he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and then utterly destroyed all the other people with the edge of the sword. Not only did he leave the king of the Amalekites alive, but then in verse 9, Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep and of the oxen and of the fatlings. And they end up telling Saul tells Samuel there's two reasons why we save the animals, even though God told us to destroy them. We save them, first of all, so we can sacrifice to the Lord. And second of all, because the people wanted to do it, and I'm just a king, who am I to resist the people? So the king is playing, he's making these excuses. And what ends up happening, first Samuel gives him these famous words. He says, it is better to obey than to sacrifice. You say you saved these animals for sacrifice. But God told you to do something, and you didn't do it. So you can't just say, I didn't do it for a good reason. There's no good reason not to obey God. So he says it's better to obey than to sacrifice. In addition, he says, because you have not executed the fierce wrath of God against Amalek, God has rejected you. And that's where we left off last week, is in the end of 1 Samuel 15, Samuel says, in verse 28, Samuel said unto Saul, the Lord hath rent the kingdom of Israel from thee this day, and hath given it to a neighbor of thine that is better than thou. So he's telling them the kingdom, your days with the kingdom are numbered. In God's eyes, he's already taken the kingdom away from you. Because he uses past tense. He said he has rent, past tense, the kingdom away from you and has given it to a neighbor. And then we finish up that chapter by Samuel having Saul bring the king over to him, King Agag, and Samuel literally hacks Agag in pieces. So you've got a prophet of God hacking somebody into pieces to execute the fierce wrath of God at the end of that 1 Samuel 15. So 1 Samuel 16. So God said he's already torn the kingdom away from Saul. In his mind, he's already chosen somebody else. He sends Samuel down to Jesse of Bethlehem. Now, Bethlehem. Now, where do we remember that from the New Testament?
Birth of Jesus.
Exactly. That's where Jesus was born. And now, why were they in Bethlehem when Jesus was born? The taxation that went along with the census. And in order for the taxation to be carried out, they went to their kind of the home of their heritage. So because because actually Mary, and more specifically, more importantly, Joseph, the parents of Jesus were descendants of David, and David was born in Bethlehem, they had to go to Bethlehem. So he sends Samuel down to Bethlehem to Jesse. Here's where you link in the book of Ruth. So Ruth talks about this guy named Boaz marrying Ruth, and they have a son, Obed, and Obed has a son, Jesse. So that's what the book of Ruth is about. That's where you tie in the book of Ruth. So he sends Samuel down to Jesse, has 7 of Jesse's sons pass in front of him. What happens after he has those 7 is that Samuel says unto Jesse, Here are all thy children? Because God has said, of all these 7 that he's had passed in front of him, these are not they. I haven't chosen any of these 7. He says, There remaineth yet the youngest, and behold, he keepeth the sheep. Samuel said unto Jesse, Send and fetch him, for we will not sit down until he come hither. Saul. David, I'm going to get one of these guys. So David is a shepherd. What does Jesus say about himself in John 10? Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. I will not lose one of my sheep. Jesus also uses references to sheep a lot. In Matthew 25, he says that there's going to be goats and there's going to be sheep that will be separated at the end of time. Also, he says there will be more joy over one sinner that repents than 99 that have no need of repentance. And he links that in. He says, if a shepherd loses one sheep and he's got 100, does he not leave the other 99 and go and search out that one that he's lost? Well, Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. I'm not going to lose any of my sheep. So Jesus has his sheep, and he knows his sheep. They will hear his voice, and he will give to them eternal life. Jesus refers to himself as a shepherd. David is a shepherd. David, at the end of 1 Samuel 16, is anointed as king. At the end of 1 Samuel 16, therefore, in the eyes of God, David is the king. But in the eyes of the people, I guess I didn't think the words that. In the eyes of the people, Saul is still the king and will still be the king until he dies in 1 Samuel 31. So what happens during the rest of this book is all a story about Saul versus David. Starting with, well, even later in 1 Samuel 16, David is really kind of receives the blessings of the Holy Spirit. In verse 13, Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed David in the midst of his brethren, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. So David has these blessings. He is a wise man. He is a strong man. He is a leader. He has these blessings of the Spirit upon him. In verse 14, it says the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord troubled him. Now that takes a minute to think about. So that means that not only is God in charge of the good spirit, the Holy Spirit, but He is in charge of the evil that troubles men as well. In Isaiah 45:7, He says, I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. So God is not just in charge of the good things. He's not just in charge of the blessings. He's in charge of the curses. He's in charge of the judgment. Because remember, with judgment, there's innocent and there's guilty. An evil spirit from the Lord troubled Saul. Saul's servants come to him and say, let's get someone to play some music for you to make you feel better. Let's get you some mood music. So they call, of all people, David. I believe that this is, and the people who have read their commentaries believe this as well, that this is kind of one of the blessings of the Spirit on David, is he was a musical man. And how do we know that David was blessed in musical things?
The Psalms.
The Psalms, exactly. David wrote a lot of the Psalms. And originally the Psalms were written as essentially musical pieces. You'll see that a lot in the titles of the Psalms. They'll talk about written for the song leader, written by the song leader. It has to. So originally these were music. The Psalms were music to be sung. David was a musical man. That was a blessing of God. Because clearly the Psalms were inspired of God and written by David. So it was the Spirit of God acting through David to allow him to do these things. David comes to Saul, plays before him, and it says that let's see, I guess it doesn't say specifically in this verse. So, here we go, in verse 23. And it came to pass when the evil spirit from God was upon Saul, that David took a harp and played with his hand. So Saul was refreshed and was well, and the evil spirit departed from him. So that's 1 Samuel 16. We've got a change of the kings in the eyes of God, not a change of the kings in the eyes of people. David, throughout the rest of this book, despite the fact that he is the anointed king of God, always refers to Saul as the anointed of the Lord. He still respects Saul's position of authority, despite the fact that in the eyes of God, he is the rightful king. He waits on the Lord. It says, blessed are they who wait on the Lord, for they shall renew their strength. So, that gives us a lesson. Even if we don't always agree with whoever's in authority, it doesn't matter. God has put those people in authority that we should follow them. So, and that's one of the lessons that took me a while to learn when I was here. I came in and I had a problem with submitting to authority. I thought that I knew what was best. And when I saw a way to get something done, I wanted to do that because I didn't know about chain of command. Wherever you are, especially if you've worked in companies a lot, you'll know that you've got a superior and they've got a superior, and everyone has somebody that they have to report to. In Romans 13, it says, submit to the authorities, for there's no authority except that which has been established by God. David is good at submitting to authority. He is, even though Saul is an evil man throughout the rest of this book, David still submits to him and refuses even to kill him when he gets the opportunity. Chapter 17. Now the Philistines gathered together their armies to battle, and were gathered together at Shokah, which belonged to Judah, and pitched between Shokah and Azekah in Ephes-dammim. So the Philistines, as I pointed out, Philistia is here, in the south, where really the Gaza Strip is today. And they are battling, it says, in the area of Judah. This is where you get David and Goliath. Goliath comes out, he says, how about you choose a champion of your forces and fight with me, and whoever wins, if they win, then we will be your servants. If I win, you be our servants. But this is a tall man. I believe it says that he's 6 cubits in height, which would be 9 feet tall. Let's see. Yeah, here we go. And there went out a champion in verse 4. Chapter 17, verse 4. And there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. So a cubit was the distance from the elbow to the tip of the finger. It was kind of generally not an exact measurement, but still it's about 18 inches. So 6 times 18 inches, 6 times a foot and a half, that's 9 feet. And then a span, and I believe the span was from the base of the hand to the tip. So we're talking about a tall guy, like 9'6". Big guy. Nobody wants to fight him. He comes out and he gives this challenge day by day. Well, David's father has him go out to check on his brothers at the battlefield. And David hears this challenge and says, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that defies the armies of the living God? Goes to Saul and says, let me go out to fight him. Because God is with us. God is not with them. God is with us. He says, when I've been a shepherd out in my field, I've killed a lion and a bear. So David is not this little weakling that he gets portrayed as in popular fiction. Is all I can put it, because the way that they portray him is not right. So David says, I've killed a lion and a bear. I can kill this guy. Not to mention he's big, a big target, and probably not very agile, not very fast. Saul says, okay, I'm going to give you this armor. David says, no, I haven't tried this. I haven't proven it. I don't wear armor. He just takes a sling and his staff and goes out, takes 5 stones, but it only takes 1. And you'll hear about it, if you read some of the commentary, they'll talk about these people who are good with slings, and they can hit like a hare. These people who are good with slings. So he runs out towards the Philistine. He runs out towards Goliath, and Goliath taunts him and says, am I a dog that you come at me with a staff? He says, let me read this. Over in verse 43. The Philistine said unto David, am I a dog that thou comest to me with staves? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give thy flesh unto the fowls of the air, and to the beasts of the field. Then said David to the Philistine, thou comest to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a shield, but I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. This day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand, and I will smite thee, and take thine head from thee, and I will give the carcasses of the hosts of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air, and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. So David has faith. He runs at him, flings that stone right between the eyes. It says it sinks into his forehead. He falls down, and they'll talk about that in Sunday school. They don't talk about what happens next in Sunday school. David goes over and cuts off his head and carries his head back to Jerusalem. That's what it says happens next. So David has this great victory, and because of this victory and what happens after this, so that kind of encompasses 1 Samuel 17. After this, because of his victory, Saul puts him in a position of command, but Saul doesn't like it when he starts winning. Because in 1 Samuel 18, in verse 6, it says, when David was returned from the slaughter of the Philistines, that the women came out of all cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul. And in verse 7, the women answered one another as they played and said, Saul hath slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. Whoops. Whoops. The commander is greater than the king in the eyes of the people. But, if you think about it, the commander is actually the king in the eyes of God. So, Saul was very wrong. The saying displeased him in verse 8. He said, they have ascribed unto David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed but thousands, and what can he have more but the kingdom? And it says in verse 10 and 11 that the next day the evil spirit comes on him again. Well, the evil spirit's kind of already on him there. But the evil spirit comes on him. David comes to try and play in front of him. He gets a javelin after David, throws him, tries to set him and smite him to the wall. Throws a javelin at him. David flees away. But David's, even that, and it says David avoided out of his presence twice in verse 11. So he's trying to kill him again and again and again. And keep that in mind. Saul is repeatedly trying to kill David. The rest of that chapter talks about how Saul gives one of his daughters first he says he's going to give one of the daughters, the elder daughter. Then he takes it back and ends up giving that daughter to another person. Then he says, I'm going to give my younger daughter. The reason he says he's going to give his younger daughter is because he is trying to ensnare David. He knows he doesn't have a lot of money. And in order to get a wife, you have to have a dowry. A dowry is essentially a purchase price for the wife. Because if you think about it this way, you are buying the wife out of the house of the father in order you're essentially decreasing the productivity of that household. You're increasing the productivity of your own household. As a result, you're kind of paying for that decreased productivity of that other household. Well, David is a poor man. He doesn't have the money to buy a king's daughter. So Saul says, you don't have to buy her. You don't need a dowry. The thing that I want is go get me 100 foreskins of the Philistines. Kind of a weird request. David goes to get 200. Doubles it. Brings him back. Saul gives David his daughter, but he hates David all the more. It says in verse 29, Saul was yet the more afraid of David, and Saul became David's enemy continually. So in verse 19, David and Jonathan come together. Jonathan is the son of Saul. This is another thing to keep in mind. Jonathan is the son of Saul. Jonathan loves David. Jonathan is the friend of David the longest day of his life. So Jonathan says, I'm going to talk to, first of all, he hears Saul, his father, talking about killing David again, and says to David, go hide. I'm going to talk to my father. I'm going to get him to calm down about this. He gets his father to swear that he's not going to try to kill David again. Well, that lasts all of about 5 minutes. Saul is not a faithful man. He'll swear a lot. He'll swear up and down saying he's going to do something and won't do it. In verse 6 it says, Saul hearkened unto the voice of Jonathan, and Saul swears, the Lord liveth, he shall not be slain. Well, then it says in verse 8, there was a war again, and David went out, and I'm in chapter 19 I should say, and fought with the Philistines and slew them with a great slaughter, and they fled from him. And the evil spirit from the Lord was upon Saul as he sat in his house with a javelin in his hand, and David played with his hand. And Saul sought to smite David even to the wall with the javelin again. So that promise lasted all about 4 verses. Now we don't know the exact period of time. It could have been weeks, months, a year, but still, and the Bible has seen fit to show that Saul is not very good at keeping his promises. Not only that, in verse 11, he sends messengers to watch David at his house, try and kill him in his house. His wife, fortunately, is faithful, and she allows him to, or helps him to escape. And then David flees and goes to Samuel, just thinks they'll be safe at Samuel. And then Saul tries to kill him there, but God foils that attempt and actually causes them to compulsively prophesy. And I'm not exactly sure what the meaning of that word would be in that case, but it causes them to compulsively prophesy. And he ends up taking off at least most of his clothes and lying down. The Bible says he lies down naked all day and all night. So Saul comes to try and kill David while he's with Samuel. God interferes and says no. And it makes him look like a fool in the end of it because he's laying down naked, probably in some kind of ecstatic language. So picture a Pentecostal church on Sunday. And that's might have been what it's looked like. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. So in chapter 20, David keeps on running and comes to Jonathan again. Because Jonathan went to his father and said to David, now you're safe. My father's not going to try and kill you anymore. So David, after having been killed by Saul 3 times now, once with a javelin, once at his house, and once after he had fled all the way to Samuel, comes to Jonathan and says, yeah, so I thought you said your dad wasn't going to kill me anymore. What's this all about, these 3 death attempts that have happened in the meantime? And David says, basically, he's just telling you, in verse 3, David says, thy father certainly knoweth that I have found grace in thine eyes. He says he knows we're friends. He's going to tell you whatever you want to hear. He's not telling you the truth. He's trying to kill me. So they concoct this plan. Jonathan's going to go talk to Saul again and let David know if he's still trying to seek his life. Long story short, he is. David goes on the run again. And what ends up happening now is 2 times Saul comes after David, and David has the opportunity to kill him. Let's look at those 2 times now. So David goes on the run. I can't skip past anything because there's too many important things. So David goes on the run. There's some things that happen. In chapter 21, David goes to get some supplies from the priests. And this is actually where David gets some of the showbread from off of the table of showbread in the tabernacle. And what Jesus refers to this when he and his disciples are walking through the fields on the Sabbath and they grab some corn, basically some food in the field and eat it. The Pharisees then, I was trying to say Philistines, they're kind of like the Philistines in being unrighteous, but the Pharisees say it's unlawful for you to do what you're doing. And Jesus says, have you not read how David and his companions ate of the showbread, which was not lawful? But because it was the Sabbath and the showbread was being switched, they would switch the bread once a week. So basically, the showbread, there was this one on the table of showbread, which was one of the pieces of furniture in the tabernacle. There were these 12 loaves of bread representing the 12 tribes of Israel, because it says, I'm not going to go into that, it would take a long time, and I don't think I actually drew 12. I drew 16. Anyways. Or 14. Anyways, so David eats the bread. Saul ends up hearing about it. Saul ends up hearing by this guy Doeg the Edomite. So he's an Edomite. He's one of the enemies of Israel, one of the neighbors of Israel. So Saul ends up going and killing all these priests. Saul is so bent, Saul is so warped in his judgment that he goes and kills 85 priests of God. Bad idea. What's that?
You show table of fruit.
Oh, yeah, if you want to show that to Fred. So,
Sounds like Saul in the New Testament.
yeah. So Saul in the New Testament is kind of aptly named. And then he becomes, obviously, his name is changed to Paul. In chapter 23, Saul chases after David, and then is called away at the last second because the Philistines come into war. So David is rescued in that. In chapter 24, then Saul goes out and seeks after David again, but God delivers Saul into the hands of David. It says that in verse 3 of chapter 24, he came to the sheepcotes by the way, where was a cave, and Saul went in to cover his feet. Now there's two thoughts as to what covering the feet meant. So Saul and his armies have gone out to seek David. They're in this southern area in Judah, southern area of Israel. Saul goes in to cover his feet. That's either thought to mean he's relieving himself, he's going to the bathroom, or he's going to sleep. I think the context would support he's going to sleep, he's taking a nap, because David is able to go up to him and cut off the front of his garment. It says he cut off his skirt. Now it's possible that he could have just been not paying attention or taken off his garment, but clearly David got close to him, was in a position where David could have killed him. God had delivered him into his hands, and even his army, David's army, was saying, go ahead and kill him. Get this guy off our back. But David respects him. He says in verse 6, he said unto his men, the Lord forbid, this is 24 verse 6, he said unto his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing unto my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch forth mine hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord. So David respected Saul's position as king, despite everything that Saul is trying to do against David. But when Saul goes out of the cave, David cries after him and says, why are you trying to kill me? Makes him feel really bad about what he's doing. And once again, Saul swears, I'm not going to try and kill you anymore. But David's smart enough to know, I'm not going to trust you out. I'll trust you about as far as I can throw you, but that's not very far. So, in chapter 25 is all about David attaining his second wife, Abigail. So his first wife is Michal, the younger daughter of Saul. His second wife is Abigail, who has an unrighteous husband, who doesn't want to give David his troops any food, even though his troops have been protecting this guy's shepherds in the wilderness. So they're originally going to go up and actually just completely destroy this guy's house and all of his family. And it even says, David says, sometimes the Bible uses some language that we wouldn't necessarily agree with. He says, originally swears, God do so and more to me, if there remaineth in the morning any that remaineth of his household that pisseth against the wall. So he's going to kill all the men, because men are the only ones that pee against the wall. Anyways, so but then he ends up getting turned away from it. This righteous woman, Abigail, his wife, this guy's wife, comes out, gives him all this food and says, please forgive, the iniquity be on my head. And David sees her righteousness, this guy ends up dying. God smites him down. He takes her as his wife. So that's what chapter 25 is all about. Chapter 26. It happens again. Saul chasing after David again. Same general area. Southern Judah. Same general area. Saul comes down. It says in chapter 26, verse 3, Saul pitched in the hill of Hakilah, which is before Jeshimon. By the way, let's see if I can find Jeshimon here. I can't find Jeshimon. But I know it says the Ziphites came up to tell Saul that where he was. So it's somewhere around Ziph here. So then God puts them in a deep sleep in, let's see, chapter 26, verse 12. Because a deep sleep from the Lord was fallen upon them, they were able to go in amongst them. David and his nephew Abishai went in amongst them. And Abishai is going to be a problem in David's side again and again, along with his brother Joab. We're going to get into that probably next week. But Abishai says, let me smite him even to the ground. I won't hit him again. I'm just going to hit him once. I'm just going to stab him and kill him, stick him to the ground with a bug. David says, no, we're not going to. And he says again, Let's see, let's go over that. Abishai said to David in verse 8, God hath delivered thine enemy into thine hand this day. Now therefore let me smite him, I pray thee, with the spear even to the earth at once, and I will not smite him the second time. Because that won't happen. Yeah.
Wasn't Abishai a real mighty warrior for David?
Oh yeah. He was a mighty warrior. He was a very mighty man, but he was also a prophet, as was his brother Joab, and we'll get into that. David says to Abishai, destroy him not, for who can stretch forth his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? David said furthermore, as the Lord liveth, the Lord shall smite him, or his day shall come to die, or he shall descend into battle and perish. The Lord forbid that I should stretch forth mine hand against the Lord's anointed. But I pray thee, take thou now the spear that is at his bolster and the cruse of water, and let us go. So once again, he takes some items to prove how close he was to Saul. Then he goes a little ways away and cries out to them and says, first of all, he says to Saul's commander, Abner, he says, Abner, you're not doing your job. We got this close, we could have killed your master. You're not doing your job. And Saul, why are you still being so unrighteous and hateful towards me? I haven't done anything to you. But remember what Jesus says in John 15. He says, if the world hated me, they will hate you. And Peter continuously tells the people he's writing to, especially in 1 Peter, happy are you when you are persecuted. James says, count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations, knowing this, that the trying of faith worketh patience. But let patience have her perfect work, that ye may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing. So these trials that are happening to David are all for a reason, to mature him. God has to put us through trials to mature us in the truth. Otherwise, you don't mature going to a picnic. You don't mature going to the beach. You mature going to the fire. We are like silver and gold being refined, and we have to be refined through the fire. So David's being refined through the fire. He makes Saul feel bad again about going out and trying to kill him, which he should feel bad about it. And Saul says in verse 21, I have sinned. Return, my son David, for I will no more do thee harm, because my soul was precious in thine eyes this day. Behold, I have been a fool and have erred exceedingly. Good words and fair speeches. But David knows better. David answered and said, behold the king's spear, and let the young man come over and fetch it. The Lord render to every man his righteousness and his faithfulness, for the Lord delivered thee into my hand today, but I would not stretch forth my hand against the Lord's anointed. Let's see, in 25, Saul said to David, blessed be thou, my son David, thou shalt both do great things, and also shalt still prevail. So, that's the last time that Saul and David meet, because next time, Saul's going to be dead. David doesn't trust Saul, doesn't listen to him, and actually what he does at this point is he goes over to live in the land of the Philistines. He says, if I go to actually live in the land of the Philistines, Saul's not going to try and seek me anymore. So that's what he does. He goes and he lives with this, he goes to this guy named Achish. Now he had gone to Achish before, and Achish had given him a bad reaction at that point, or he was afraid of Achish at that point, so he pretended to be insane. But now he goes back to Achish and finds favor in his eyes and actually dwells in this town called Ziklag. He dwells in Ziklag, which is kind of right on the border between Philistia and Judah. And he spends the rest of the 1 Samuel in Ziklag. Meanwhile, and that's what chapter 27 and part of chapter 28 are about, meanwhile, the Philistines are coming out to battle with Saul for the final time. The rest of the book is about, the book of 1 Samuel is about David's down here in Ziklag. The Philistines go out to battle with Saul at Mount Gilboa. Saul is worried. Saul knows God has departed from him. Saul tries to seek the counsel of the Lord through the priests. Well, too bad he's killed 85 of them. God's not really looking to talk to them anymore. He doesn't have the prophet anymore. anymore. Samuel at this point has actually died. So he doesn't, God is not speaking to him by dreams. He's not speaking to him by the Urim and Thummim, which was the way that the priest spoke to God. So what he does is he goes to a familiar spirit, a woman who has a familiar spirit. So he goes to Endor, and he goes to the witch at Endor. And has her call up Samuel from the dead, the spirit of Samuel. But what I believe happened is that God calls up the spirit of Samuel, because when she hears the spirit of Samuel, she gets freaked out. She's like, whoa, what's going on here? So God calls up the spirit of Samuel to Saul. And what Samuel says is, tomorrow you're dying. Tomorrow you and your son are going to die. You're going to die in this battle. God's done. So that's what happens. That's in chapter 28. In chapter 31, we finish out the book by God doing what David said. He said, let him smite him in battle. So in chapter 31, it says, in chapter 31, verse 1, now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell down slain in Mount Gilboa. And the Philistines followed hard upon Saul and upon his sons, and the Philistines slew Jonathan. Now Jonathan was the son that was a great friend of David, and Abinadab, and Malchishua, Saul's sons. The battle went sore against Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was sore wounded of the archers. Then said Saul unto his armor-bearer, draw thy sword and thrust me through therewith, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and abuse me, lest they come and torture me. But his armor-bearer would not, for he was sore afraid. Therefore Saul took his sword and fell upon him. And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he fell likewise upon his sword and died with him. So Saul died, and his 3 sons, and his armor-bearer, and all his men that same day together. And then these men who are near the battle, so Mount Gilboa is right about here, these men in these cities who are near it actually flee from out of their cities. The Philistines go and possess these cities, and at Bethshan, they possess the city, and they cut off Jonathan and Saul and his sons' heads and hang their bodies up on the wall of this city. So it's a very shameful day for Israel. The king is dead, the king's sons are dead, and their bodies are being displayed openly. It was, yes?
I have to inquire about this.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. It was a very shameful thing for a body to remain unburied. Even Israel, even when they would utterly destroy their enemies, would make sure to bury the bodies of their enemies before eating. Now, I don't know about if there was enormous slaughter in the field, but if they were executed a particular person, it will always say they then buried the body, because they didn't want it. They wouldn't go that far in shaming, because that was what God commanded. So actually, when the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard that which the Philistines had done to Saul in verse 11, all the valiant men arose and went all night and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Bethshan and came to Jabesh and burnt them there. And they took their bones and buried them under a tree at Jabesh and fasted 7 days. This is a sad end. It's a sad end to this book. Originally, the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel it's all one book in the Hebrew canon, Hebrew scripture. It's all one book. It's an artificial separation of these 2 books.
2 scrolls.
It's really just all one scroll. So we end 1 Samuel on kind of a sad note. And I should note that one thing that happened to David that we didn't talk about is David had offered his services to go up to fight against Saul with the Philistines, although his plan was, when he got up there, to turn and kill the Philistines and help Saul, despite everything that Saul had done. The Philistine princes, who are smarter than Achish, know he hasn't changed. He was killing Philistines while he was with Saul. He'll kill the Philistines again if he gets the opportunity. So they send him back. But when he comes back to Ziklag, he finds that the Amalekites have come and carried his wives off and burnt the city. So they go and get all their wives and all the things back and smite the Amalekites. That's one thing that happened in chapter 30 that we skipped over. But that thus ends 1 Samuel. In 2 Samuel, we're going to see David coming to the actual throne. He's been the anointed king from 1 Samuel 16, but we're going to see him actually rise to be the king on the throne, first of just the southern kingdom, and then of the whole kingdom. So one of the big things that we see in these second 15 chapters of 1 Samuel is, like I said, submitting to authority and recognizing God's hand, even in the evil men that we have to deal with. David wrote, evil men are thy sword, speaking to God. Evil men are the sword of God. It talks about the Assyrians who come in and carry off northern Israel captive. God says in Isaiah that they were just the axe. That's all they were. They were his axe. And when the Assyrians start to get big-headed about it, he says, will the axe boast itself against him who wields the axe? God says, I'm the one who's doing what I want with these people. So there's nothing that they can boast about. And then he says, I'm going to destroy the axe to show that I'm the one who's controlling. So Saul was an evil man, but still David gave him his allegiance to a certain extent and recognized that he was the anointed of the Lord. So in the same way, we need to look even at those in authority who we don't necessarily like their judgment always, but we have to submit to their authority. When we can, we always bring the Word of God into every situation as much as is possible. So David showed Saul where he was wrong, but he didn't try and usurp authority from him. So we can show our authority where they're wrong according to the Word of God if we get the opportunity, like was given to David. But that's all something that we have to pray and wait on God for. So I believe that one of the big lessons of tonight is submitting to authority and waiting on God for the opportunities that he presents to us, both with respect to witnessing and to sharing the Word with others, both with respect to sharing the Word with those within, with ministering to each other, with ministering even to those in authority. So there's a time for everything. God, that all comes in the time of God. John, do you have a question? Okay. Well, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, thank you for your truth. Thank you for your word. Thank you for these men, Lord. Thank you for what you're doing in their lives. God, I just pray that you will give us the strength to walk according to thy will and according to thy word, to bear our cross, God. Jesus said that if we don't bear our cross, we can't be his disciple. So teach us to bear the cross, to speak truth no matter what happens, and to undergo persecutions. And we'll give you thanks and praise as you change our hearts and our minds. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you, man. Thank you all. I couldn't remember exactly when I hit the